Good morning. So today we're going to take it a step further and actually walk through the steps of completing the square. So let's refresh our memory on what we talked about yesterday. So I want to be able to find a C value when we're talking about our standard form of a quadratic, ax squared plus bx plus c. I want to find a C value that allows our factors to be the same, which means they end up being a perfect square. So what is going to add to 10 but multiply to this blank, but those numbers are the same? So what would go in the blank? Well, what two numbers are the same that add to 10 would be 5. So 5 times 5 means our blank is 25. And if you recall from yesterday, we take our b value and we divide it by 2, and then I take that number and I square it, and that's how I get that C value there. So on number 2, we have a negative 14, but we want to figure out what that C value is. Well, if I do negative 14, what two numbers are the same that give us negative 14 would be negative 7 and negative 7, which is really what negative 14 divided by 2 is. But then if I take and I square negative 7, I get a positive 49. So again, we're finding that C value by doing b divided by 2 squared. So something we're going to have to remember, C is equal to b divided by 2 squared when we are completing the square. That's going to be an important formula that we're going to want to use today. Okay, let's refresh our memory on how to solve a quadratic that is using the square root. So remember, to undo a square, we take the square root. So on this first problem, x squared equals 16, I would just take the square root of both sides. And we get x's, well, the square root of 16 is 4. So I actually get a positive or a negative 4. So remember that this 2 is telling me I have two solutions. So that means, in reality, this is really a positive 4 and a negative 4. Because if I take 4 and I square it, that is 16. But if I take negative 4 and square it, doesn't that also give me a positive 16? So both of those numbers work. So anytime you do a square root, you must have the plus and minus sign, which is this right here. That must be there because that's showing you have your two cases. Okay, so our next one, it looks a little different, but since that x plus 2, that whole part is being raised to the second power, I can go ahead and take the square root of both sides. And we have to do it to both sides because if I do it to one, I got to do it to the other. And what happens is that gets rid of that power of 2, so I just have x plus 2. And the square root of 9 we all know is 3, but remember we have to have plus or minus 3. Well, now this particular problem, unlike the other one, there's an additional step. I need to subtract 2 on both sides to get x by itself. Now watch how I write this. The negative 2, this part comes first. I'm going to have a negative 2 plus or minus 3. So here's what I do to simplify it. Negative 2 plus or minus 3. Let's break it up into the two parts. It's either going to be negative 2 plus 3 or it's going to be negative 2 minus 3. So when I evaluate that, negative 2 plus 3 is 1. Negative 2 minus 3 is negative 5. So my two solutions are x equals 1 and negative 5. In no particular order. You can write them either way. But those are our two solutions. So our next one. We take the square root of both sides. And we have x minus 3 is equal to plus or minus 5. And then I have to add 3 to both sides. So x is going to be 3 plus or minus 5. So if we separate that out, 3 plus or minus 5 gives us two different options. We have 3 plus 5 or we have 3 minus 5. 3 plus 5 is 8. 3 minus 5 is negative 2. So our values are 8 and negative 2. And the last one on this page is unique because it's not a perfect square, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be. So we're going to take the square root of both sides, and we're going to get x minus 6 equals, and I'm just going to write this as plus or minus the square root of 12, because there is no perfect square of 12. So then I add 6 to both sides, So x is going to be 6 plus or minus the square root of 12. And now all we need to do is break down that 12 into the simplest radical form. So it breaks down into 4 and 3. The 4 becomes 2 and 2. There are my friends, my group of 2, and my 3 doesn't have a friend. So I can rewrite this as 6 plus or minus 2 square root of 3. And that is just my answer. You could write it separately as 6 plus 2 square root of 3 and 6 minus 2 square root of 3, but you do not have to. You can keep it as 1. Just know that that plus and minus is giving you your 2 solutions. Okay, so if you think about problems like this, what's going to complete that? It says complete each quadratic to write it as a perfect square and then solve it. So think about what we were doing earlier today. What's going to fill in that blank? Well, what two numbers add to 6? Well, 3 and 3 add to 6, so 3 times 3 is going to give me a 9 here. And because that's a perfect square, I know that this is going to be x plus 3 squared equals 36. And now this looks identical to the problems we just finished. We're going to take the square root of both sides, and I have x plus 3 is plus or minus 6, because the square root of 36 is 6, and then I subtract 3 to both sides, and so x is negative 3 plus or minus 6, and so if we come over here and let's separate that out, we have negative 3 plus 6, and we have negative 3 minus 6. Negative 3 plus 6 is 3, negative 3 minus 6 is negative 9, so x is 3 and negative 9 in no particular order. So you can complete the square and then solve using your square roots. So the steps for solving a quadratic by completing the square. Let's go through all of them. First step, you want all the variables on one side, and then the constants on the other side. If a is not 1, you're going to divide by a. Well, the unique thing on this right now, I'm not going to give you any problems where a is not 1 at this point, so we don't really need to worry about that step. So then we got to complete the square by doing that b over 2 squared. That's going to fill in the blank. But remember, when I add a blank to one side, I must add a blank to the other side. So make sure you're putting it on both sides. And then you factor each of them, and you take the square root of both sides and solve for that value. So let's walk through a problem. Okay, so our first one, we have x squared plus 12x minus 2 equals 0. So the first step is to get just the variables by themselves and the constants on the other side. So I'm going to add this 2 to both sides. And I'm going to have x squared plus 12x plus, and I'm going to actually put a blank there for our new c value, equals 2, and then remember, if I add something to one side, I have to add it to the other side. So I'm going to put the plus blank on both sides. So now we got to think about, well, what's going to go in that blank? Well, what two numbers add to 12? 6 and 6 do. So 6 times 6 gives me 36. And remember, that's really taking b divided by 2 squared. That's how we're getting that 36. But if I put a 36 there, I must put a 36 here. And then we know, since we have completed the square, that this equation right here that I highlighted factors into a perfect square. So we have x plus 6 squared equals 2 plus 36 is 38. And now we can do the square root. So we square root both sides, and I have x plus 6 equals plus or minus the square root of 38. And then I subtract 6 to both sides. And x is going to equal negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 38. And 38 does not go down any further, so that is your answer. Let's walk through one more problem here. So again, step 1, get our variables on one side and our constant on the other. Constant means it doesn't have a variable, so the 12, I'm going to have to subtract 12 to both sides. And I have x squared minus 8x, put in your blank. And then I have a negative 12 because there's a 0, and a negative 12 is negative 12, and then put in your other blank. So then I do negative 8 divided by 2 squared to get that blank. It's your b divided by 2 squared. and that's going to give me negative 4 squared is 16. So I put 16 on both of my sides. Because I completed the square with that blank, we know that this equation is a perfect square. So it is going to become x minus 4 squared. And notice, you guys, this minus 4 here comes from, I'm going to change my highlighter, comes from this right here. Like negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. So like before you square it, that's the number that's going to go there. And then when I combine the negative 12 and 16, I get 4. And then I take the square root of both sides, and I have x minus 4, and the square root of 4 is 2, so I have plus or minus 2. And then I add 4 to both sides, so x is 4 plus or minus 2. So 4 plus or minus 2 when broken down, 4 plus 2 and 4 minus 2. So 4 plus 2 is 6, and 4 minus 2 is 2. So that means x equals 6 and 2 in no particular order. And that is how you complete this.